Thank you so much for attending my presentation about power creep in Pokemon, and first let's take a look at how I gather my data. The initial idea was extremely simple. What are the average stats for each generation? I started out by tracking base stat total, but it didn't seem to work out very well, and thus I turned my attention to individual stats. I decided to collect the HP stat, the highest attacking stat, and the highest defensive stat of each Pokemon in overuse throughout 3 separate generations. So what 3 gens did I pick? The first was obvious. Gen 9 is current and will give me the best picture of what stats are like now. Next, I decided to get data on Generation 3 as it marks the shift away from max stat experience and changed the meaning of base stats forever. I wanted one more and ended up going with Gen 5. Gen 6 and 7 were enticing, but Mega Evolutions posed a problem as I couldn't really account for them. They inflate the overall stats, but since you can only have one per team, it becomes nearly impossible to find a truly accurate number. Gen 5 was the obvious choice, bolstered further by its reputation as the power creep generation, which I was curious to look into. First up, let's see what Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald have to offer. The attacking and defensive stats were relatively equal, with the former having a slight edge, but that's not a large issue. Attacking stats peak around 135, where the best of the best like Tyranitar, Gengar, and Salamence hang out. Even somewhat defensively oriented pokes like Cloyster and Celebi are able to dish out some serious damage and take vital KOs throughout battles. In terms of defense, we see both physical and special walls like Flurry, Snorlax, and Scarm have extremely high stats to keep them kicking, with a surprising amount lacking instant recovery moves and helpful abilities. I know the least about Gen 5, so I'll keep this section short, but we see a noticeable increase in damage output while defense stayed somewhat stagnant. Even though we would see some new defensive traits come into play, like Unaware and Regenerator, offense completely exploded. Monsters like Kyurem Black and Thundurus Therian had burst onto the scene and shattered previous OU stat records, but a whole new host of Pokemon like Lando T, Excadrill, Volcarona, and Keldeo were overtaking the old guard. Finally, we get to Gen 9, and surprisingly, offensive stats have remained as they were in Unova, albeit the average highest defensive stat has dropped almost 3 points. The highest attack stats haven't really grown, and neither has defense. In fact, the mons with extremely high defensive stats have all but fallen out of the metagame as more and more offensively oriented Pokemon are given one or more great defense stat. Look at Great Tusk, Kingambit, Gouging Fire, and Raging Bolt, all of which help to keep the average highest defensive stat high. But this is where the stats don't tell the full story. While Game Freak had seemingly stopped giving out higher and higher base stats, they went absolutely berserk on everything else. Between Gen 5 and Gen 9, offensive demons were given more and more ways to beat the shit out of each other, largely due to generational gimmicks. Gen 6 and 7 were littered with Mega Evolutions that put perennially strong attackers to shame, while good defensive Megas were hard to find, although they did exist. Z-moves were yet another way to break past walls. Terrestrialization has let frail offensive pokes get out of their weaknesses and dominate with setup moves. The only metagame without a generational gimmick present in OU, Gen 8, has seen the highest average turn count of every gen since the 4th. Defensive pokes are given new tools, but the best of the best are still mostly big blobs with Unaware or Regenerator. This approach is kinda working right now, but they can't keep giving these two abilities to pokes with higher and higher stats, or defense will get extremely boring. I enjoy defense in Pokemon. Finding ways to check the strongest attackers is very interesting, but the number of viable ways to do so is getting lower and lower. In conclusion, the way the offensive and defensive stats and overuse have changed throughout the generations helps to paint the picture of power creep in Pokemon and how it's evolved. I hope that the concept of defense is expanded upon in future years, because right now it doesn't look that good. Thank you so much for watching.